Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. Well, Brent, we've been trying to get some time to spend on the podcast with you for a while now, and I know you're an avid turkey hunter, and it sounds like you've had an eventful spring, at least going to several places to turkey hunt. But we appreciate you coming on to talk turkey with us.
Well, my pleasure. I've been binging a little bit. It's during the turkey season when I'm driving a lot that I binge the podcast. So I've been having fun catching up on wild turkey science.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Yeah, appreciate it. Glad to have you as a listener.
Yeah. Well, Brent, I can think back maybe 2 or 3 years that we've interacted online and met a few times in person here and there. And I've also listened to you on other podcasts, and you've always had, what would you say, the Hayes boys from MossyOak called you the historian type of demeanor about you. So I've just really appreciated seeing several of the things that you've collected over the time, and then hearing you talk about the history of wild turkeys, and that's really what spawned us to reach out to you to get you on the show.
Yeah, I really think turkey hunters pay more attention to the history than maybe some other groups of hunters. I think maybe it's because we have that deep respect for the turkey, which leads us towards the deep respect of those who came before and the society we're a part of. And what's great to me is that there's an interest out there for it. There's actually an audience to talk about some of the history, and it doesn't have to be boring. It's not, it's not like a date and a name you have to remember for a test. It's people that walked in our shoes before us, whether that's from the hunting or research side, and we share a lot in common. I think there is an appeal.
Yeah, I feel like I think you hit on something there that probably resonates with a lot of people, including me, and it's that I feel like there's much more of a culture of storytelling and almost like romance with the pastime when it comes to hunting the wild turkey compared to other species.
Absolutely, Will. I think that's why we have such a rich pantheon of literature, and there's no end to what types of literature on turkey you can read about. There's
Right.
actual good fiction. There's really great, what I call it, memoirs. There is kind of the philosophy, like 10th Legion, and of course, even a guy like me who likes to read some of the studies and Symposium articles where there's actual work on the ground happening that we're learning or maybe unlearning things. I think it's fun to have kind of a lot to choose from.
Yeah. And I think too, the other thing that I've really gained an appreciation for since we started this podcast a year and a half ago almost now is how important it is for people that want to work with turkeys, and I include myself in that category, to really have a comprehensive knowledge of the history of the loss and the subsequent restocking efforts and all of that stuff, because this show has forced me to go back and read a lot of things that I otherwise wouldn't have because they're not relevant to my day-to-day job as a researcher. But like going back in time and looking at some of those scientific articles that are decades old, and some of even the gray literature, which I'm sure you read a lot, and learning from that and realizing how many things have been lost, how much knowledge has been lost over time. I think that really emphasizes the importance, like I said, of somebody that wants to work with turkeys and understanding, kind of the entire collection of turkey literature and not just the modern stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, something that resonated with me when I was listening to you talk about it, and I was kind of thinking it through. You know, I've the community and passion of the group, and my experience with wild turkeys in the wild, pursuing them. You know, I guess that passion from the group resonates with me because of my own experience with turkeys in the woods. You know, like it's just uh, they're so similar, and I can understand that point of view. And I was thinking, you know, it's almost like it's poetic, and that's what you end up with, this body of literature that I know you're really familiar with, and I want to hear you talk about it. But we see all kinds of literature emerge from that, where people felt so strongly about their relationship with turkeys that they felt compelled to write. And in fact, some of the early poets actually even were writing about turkeys and their relationship with turkeys. So there actually was poetry that came from that. I remember uncovering some really interesting poetry from, I think it was the mid 1800s, even, you know, where they were talking about, uh, you know, how special turkeys were to them. So that's a kind of another view on this dialogue. I just don't. I mean, maybe there are other species that people feel that way about from a hunting perspective, but I don't see that commonly. Is that your experience, Brent, when you're kind of comparing across species?
Yeah, it is. And I'm an equal opportunity hunter. I like to hunt everything from small game to big game,
Mm-hmm.
fin, feathers, fur. I like it all. And
Yeah.
my day job is food research, and it extends well into my hunting and outdoor gardening and gathering. And because I like to, eat what I produce as well.
Hmm.
And so I've crossed into a lot of the hunting realms. And very uniquely, the wild turkey community seems to have that little deeper thread. And I
Hmm.
like to say it's more of a lifestyle versus a leisure pursuit. So there's a lot of, sports people out there that may classify themselves as a deer hunter, or a bass fisherman or whatever, and they're very passionate about it, but it still becomes an individual pursuit and less of a community because
Hmm.
of the way the wild turkey gets its hooks in us.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow, there's my pun for the
That's
day.
perfect.
Yeah, somehow it becomes a lifestyle.
Yeah. That is an interesting observation from both of you. That if you think about it, like in the deer hunting community, I don't feel like there's like a book or a series of books that every person who considers themselves an avid deer hunter has to have read. But that is
Hmm.
definitely the case, I feel like, for turkeys. Like if you consider yourself an avid turkey hunter and you haven't read, any of Kelly's books, let alone 10th Legion, then what are you doing?
Hmm.
Yeah, there's a debate. Old pro turkey hunter or 10th Legion.
I've
That's
gotten
a
asked that so many
kind of
times.
pops up. Yeah.
And I actually just read and very much enjoyed the natural history aspect of one of Nunnery's other books. He may have additional ones as well, but Lift Mine Eyes into the Hills. And I thought that was a really
Yeah.
enjoyable one as well.
Yeah, and that's actually more of a history book in the
Yeah.
Mississippi kind of region. It's got some really, really neat things going back to the Native Americans, and I found that enjoyable as well.
Yeah, I did too. Well, let's go ahead and go back in time to that era if y'all are okay with that. And let's talk a little bit about what precipitated, states having to take such drastic action that they did in terms of, trying to restore the wild turkey and keep it from going extinct. What was it that kind of led up to that situation based on, what you've been able to glean over the past many years?
Well, I think if you look back at the wild turkey in America, and you see that the hunting of the turkey largely was, I've said it before, was done with the stomach, instead of the heart.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the early depredation of flocks was not just habitat; it was also hunting. Of course, hunting is still the number one cause of death of gobblers, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
But to that point, you go back and look at some of that early literature that's out there, and Albert Hazen Wright, who I like to go back to, that in the journal The Auk. And if you want to go back to where a lot of the information on the wild turkey is at, you go to those ornithological journals in the 1800s, and that's where a lot of information was being captured. But in 1914, he put together a really fantastic 5-part series in the Auk on the early history of the wild turkey. And it's clear that turkeys were valued for their food value more than anything. And there was market hunting and of course, the habitat piece. And there just wasn't the same, I would call it, shrine around turkey hunting then that we see now, because people mostly hunted for a different reason. Having said that, there are still those few that really got it. They were very passionate about it. And that was the group that kind of, kept that spark alive during those really dark years up through the 1920s and 30s. But it really wasn't until I think it was noticed that the turkey was being threatened that people really started to care. So I would go back and say in the mid 1800s, you had early to mid 1800s, you had naturalists who were the wild turkey experts. So, Bartram was 1700s. And then you had Bonaparte, who was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, Lucien Bonaparte, and Audubon, who were kind of working together, John James Audubon. They really were kind of the ones that, in my opinion, kind of rekindled the flame for the wild turkey and Wilson with his book. But all these brought the wild turkey back into people's homes where they may not have interacted with a turkey, and they saw the grandeur of the American wild turkey. And in Audubon's book that he did, I think it's significant that the very first color photo plate, or that he did, was the wild turkey gobbler. That's the first plate in the book.
I didn't know
and
that.
If I'm not mistaken, I went back and I was trying to count the number of pages. Of the 435 species he covered, the most content he wrote about any bird was the wild turkey. I mean, he was taken with it. Now we can talk about the myths and I wouldn't call them urban legends, but Audubon created some rural legends with some of what he wrote too, which is interesting. But that's, to me, what kind of got people fired back up. So that was the first piece of it.
And I went back and read Audubon and a number of other authors from that time period, including Bartram and a couple others. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Audubon that was describing laying in the woods under leaves and watching turkeys during their nesting activities. Do you remember a passage related to that?
I do. Yeah.
To me, when I read that, I was like, I would have really liked this guy.
The dedication.
Yeah, like he was so passionate about what he was doing. It, just kind of bled through in the writing to me.
Yeah, his personal seal became a wild turkey gobbler. That was the Audubon personal seal, and he had a lifelong love of turkeys. I've always wished I knew exactly where he painted the turkeys he did. Likely Louisiana, not for sure. There's not great records on that, but he spent a lot of time there observing them, for sure.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. So I guess in the time that Audubon was writing about them, that was, you said, the early 1800s, mid 1800s?
1820s and 30s.
So were they already seeing symptoms of problems with populations at that time?
Yeah. And if you go back to the 1700s when Bartram was doing his swing through the Southeast, he was the one that wrote the famous line about how the gobbles was like it was a chain of gobbles
Yeah,
across the land or whatever.
or
I
hundreds
mean,
of miles in
something.
every direction.
Yeah, turkey hunters dream about it. And
Hmm.
then Audubon, as he's writing in the 1820s, talks about there being still vast flocks in places. But then later in his writings, you start to get 1830s and 40s. Now you see that he's throwing up the flag of caution and saying, hey, there are fewer turkeys here and here. And that included some places in the Southeast, as well as I think it was New York that he said, you
Hmm.
can't even find a turkey. And
Hmm.
so he was starting to, um, you know, throw that idea out there. The turkey you know, wasn't eternal. There was some serious problems starting to happen.
Hmm. Yeah. So when was and I should have better recollection of this, admittedly, because I just read. I can't remember which one it was because I read so many of them now. But Tom Kelly was a lot more prolific than people think. I mean, and he's still he just published, I think, his last book within the past 10 years or so. Does that sound
Yeah,
right, Brent?
yeah.
Um,
It might have been. Yeah, I can't
24
remember what
2014,
it's around
2012,
in there. Yeah,
somewhere
I
around
think
there.
that might have been Unfaded Roses.
No, it wasn't that one. I
Was
think it was
one after that?
maybe. Anyways, regardless, in one of his works that I recently read, and I can't remember the name of it, but he talks about some of the early seasons when they were first established and what they entailed. Can you talk about that for a little while? Like, when seasons came about and what, states were struggling with. I mean, we had almost no science to go on at that point in time, so
Yep.
it was really a hodgepodge.
Yeah, I wrote an article in Gamekeepers a couple years ago that I need to go back to that and refresh it because I'm always collecting more data. But it was way back, like in the I want to say it was the still in the 1700s when New York made a basically a law because they were trying to protect turkeys. It
Hmm.
wasn't until later in the 1800s there was what I would call the first regulation on wild
Hmm.
turkeys. Pennsylvania put a regulation on of 2 turkeys per day. Okay, that's still pretty liberal, but hey, it's a step in the right direction. And so yeah, I've got a spreadsheet where I've gone back and a lot of the old hunting journals would publish the
Hmm.
state by state and sometimes county by
Yes.
county regulations, and that's how it looked. A lot of the states kind of had county regulations. It was a little bit of the Wild West with what
Yeah.
you could shoot and but what was interesting to me is it would have been still around the late 1800s um, where there was actually, if you look at the number of states that had seasons, there was quite a few, and I want to say about half of them the season extended into the spring. And this is the
Hmm.
late 1800s where people were hunting in March and April and even where it stopped in February in some places, in the deep South, it was referred to as the gobbling season. So
Hmm.
I think there was a lot more hunting of gobbling turkeys than people realize, but that was regional.
Hmm.
Certainly in the Midwest and the North, that wasn't a thing.
Hmm.
And I don't know if that had something to do too with just the type of habitat and the agricultural practice and everything else. But going back to tying this back to Audubon, that's where the naturalists that as much good as they did to kind of create that love of the turkey and get people interested and to cry alarm and say there's something wrong. Some of the mythology that was created, I think, probably took a while to undo as well. Some of that you have to have huge tracts of timber for something to
Hmm.
survive.
Yeah.
And there were counterpoints to that. Some of those coming from hunters, one of those being Charles Jordan, who's an interesting figure that definitely should talk about. But and then just the biological pieces where I remember Audubon talking about how gobblers would kill each other during the fight, and how the hen would cover the nest before she left it, or the gobblers would tread on the nest or eat the eggs to rebreed the hens. And I think the perception then of turkeys maybe changes in terms of what people expect a turkey's capable of, or where they can thrive, and that's some of that piece you have to unlearn. So, and it's interesting, even in the early 1900s, to see that's still the state of knowledge. It was in 1914, and this is where I'd say now the hunters are the ones primarily in the field observing turkeys. There's not a lot of research happening yet. Naturalists have kind of, they're still there, but they've kind of done their thing. Hunters are the ones that are observing and saying, now, wait a minute. Jordan, who published a series of 20 some articles in Shooting and Fishing in 1898, which I've got, I think, all but 5 of those original articles now.
Wow.
His book he was killed by a poacher in 1909. He was friends with a man named J.K. Renault from Louisiana. And apparently they both also knew Edward A. McElhaney, who was the heir of the Tabasco fortune. And he was also a conservationist and hunter. So Renault ends up giving the unpublished manuscript of Jordan's book on the wild turkey to McElhaney because he had the wherewithal to publish it, which he did. And he gave credit to Jordan, maybe not quite enough, but he did acknowledge that the source material came from there. But you can see that Jordan in the book saying, well, Audubon said this, and I've never observed that. I don't think that's right. And that's where those ideas start to be challenged. And he was very skeptical about game farm turkeys, didn't want to see the gene pool diluted. And those ideas then got picked up on with research in the States in those next few decades. But just kind of interesting how that transition happened in terms of who knew what.
Yeah, it seems like it probably had to be the naturalist at first because everybody that was hunting turkeys originally were like you said, mostly subsistence hunters. And so there weren't enough recreational hunters, but then as that changed over time, and then I guess especially as spring season started to be held, then you see that chain of custody handed off to the hunters.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to make it sound like there was no research or work happening. There was work that was happening. And one of the things I love to do is spend my leisure time trying to track down those old articles in the ornithological journals. And sometimes I get really lucky and I'll find a reprint of the article as kind of a standalone publication. And those are really kind of neat from a collector's point of view. But if you go back to 1914, one of the things I thought was interesting is the Chicago Field Museum at the time had a publication that came out called The Wild Turkey. And it's just a little pamphlet that they put together. John T. Zimmer, who was one of the curators there, basically took what he knew, a lot of it from Audubon. And that's what I would say should be considered at the time the cornerstone knowledge of the wild turkey. But it was, again, mostly from the naturalist point of view. The same year that Jordan's book, which McElhaney published, came out as a counterpoint and actually was a lot more fact driven. So it was interesting just to see, in that year where there's still kind of this is the part we're educating people on, but yet it's the lay people that were out in the field observing. But at about that time, you had people out in the field doing work. There was Herbert Stoddard, who I think, by 1935 or 6, published the Wild Turkey publication. It was part of a book, but Wild Turkey Management. And that's kind of what I would call the first publication with the word management, in the title. And he knew mostly what we needed to succeed then. That's what amazes me is I went back and read it. And he's talking about game farm turkeys. You need to be cautious there. The use of controlled burning is really, beneficial, and he's just ticking down through the points. And then others like Aldo Leopold and Stokely Ligon and others start to pick up on those things, and it's just interesting to see that that transition happens there. Sometimes I would say probably in the 30s is where you start to get enough. 1943, the Henry Mosby book comes out, The Wild Turkey in Virginia, which is really great from a biology and management perspective. But even then, I reread the part about a week ago, thinking about this, where he was quoting Stoddard about don't get confused between forest fires and controlled fires, because in people's minds at the time, fire was bad because fire is what destroyed your farm, or fire is what destroyed the timber you were going to cut. I mean, it was all related to what you could cash in on. And controlled fire wasn't really a thing, probably not since the Indians had been doing it. But Mosby and Handley make the point that even though those two are different, that the controlled fire probably doesn't work here. That's not something that's going to work in Virginia. I mean, it was kind of just a Passover, right? Where the idea was there, but people weren't completely picking up on it yet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of amazing how some of these habitat management principles that Marcus and I still expound on, and we probably have, I don't know what, Marcus, like 20 episodes talking just about fire. But people figured this out. People figured this out 100 years ago,
Yeah.
But I think that's a good point that a lot of folks may not realize, is that the field of wildlife biology wasn't really formalized and institutionalized, or at least the educational component of it wasn't institutionalized until that era of, the Leopolds and the Stoddards.
Yeah. That's, somebody needs to write a full book on those two, because they were friends, and I have seen a couple articles written on them, but not enough to satisfy me. And if you go, you can search and find Aldo Leopold's files. They're online and available. And so I've went in there and I've pulled all the wild turkey content that I can find, and I've got my own file now created. And, and it's awesome. Really interesting. There are states that were doing reintroductions, mostly with game farm turkeys, because that's what they could get access to. Drugging turkeys and trying to capture turkeys in traps was a low success endeavor. But that was happening in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and Leopold was very much involved in terms of trying to stop the game farm thing. He was talking to Arlie Shorter and Harold Blakely and others, and just saying, hey, this isn't working. We got to try to get a pure strain. And I think what they were trying to do is say, if there are pure strain turkeys in an area, we need to protect the turkeys.
Right.
And then there's a chance that they'll get a foothold. Now, habitat would have to come with that, but still that principle was right. And if you go find those files, those are a good read. There's some pretty neat stuff in there. Some good exchanges.
So the initial arguments against the game farm turkeys were actually more focused on the genetic basis, or the genetic consequences of doing so. So that was even before they realized that it wasn't going to really be a practical approach to trying to restore populations.
Yeah. And what wasn't helping is, places like Woodmont in Maryland. If you know the Woodmont Hunting Club, there was a book in 1953 that Henry P. Bridges published, which is a very interesting book, and just flawed from the perspective that they were hell-bent on selling the idea that game farm turkeys were the answer. And I found in Leopold's files an article from 1918 that a man named Quarles published, and he'd been to the Woodmont Club hunting and was very impressed. And one of the things he wrote was the guy that was currently in charge of the turkey breeding was touting the success because he had killed 1,200 turkeys on the club in 50 years of hunting. And I sat there, wow. So that's
I'm sitting here trying to figure it out, but I'm not going to do that math on the air.
That's a lot of turkeys.
And that's one guy, right? I mean, it just, it kind of baffles you. And it's funny in the Mosby book. So that's back to 43. There's a little aside there, and he even calls it humorous. He said there was a humorous suggestion from it would have been Samuel Boyer, who'd done some wild turkey survey work, that he said he was suggesting that if they really wanted a way to determine whether they had pure strain turkeys or hybrids, that you just would turn out a troop of Boy Scouts, and if the Boy Scouts could capture the turkeys, they were tame. And again, tongue in cheek, because it was just about right.
Yeah.
That's a lot of what was happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, Brent, I know we're kind of bouncing around in the timeline a lot, but you said a few things that I wanted to revisit when we're talking about what happened to turkeys. Yeah, and one of them you're talking about the bag limit, and the other the time of the year people were hunting. So, like in the 1800s and early 1900s, people were primarily hunting. Once some of those regulations were in place, they were hunting fall and winter flock. I presume, based on what you were saying.
Yeah, that would have been the vast majority of it. And again,
Yeah.
it kind of makes sense in terms of if you look at a largely agrarian, community that would have been hunting them spring and fall. And still, I've got a lot of farmer friends that would love to be out hunting, but
Mm-hmm.
it's time to plant or time to harvest. And
Yeah.
and so it kind of made sense that did fall hunting for turkeys develop because, is it the chicken or the egg, is my thought. Did it develop because that's what people wanted to do, or is it because that's what made sense at the time?
Yeah.
And it's when they could. And plus, in most of the country, if you had a smokehouse or a larder, it's a lot easier to keep a few turkeys and a few deer through the winter months than it is if you're harvesting all that in the spring and have to eat it in 2 weeks.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
And also they were just shooting males and females, which is one of the problems right there. The female harvest was a big part of the harvest.
So, absolutely. Yeah, no question about it. And the method of hunting, despite the season, was kind of a free for all. And again, I know I wrote about it in the Gamekeepers article, but it's kind of fun to go back and look at in the late 1800s what they had to start to outlaw, or in the early 1900s, because people were hunting by jacklight or punt guns, or they were hunting using explosives. I mean, and turkeys specifically in Missouri were mentioned as prohibited to hunt with explosives in that era.
So what, they were just like feeding them in an area and getting them all congregated and then blowing them up?
Yeah. I
Wow.
mean, which it's hard to think about that now, but I attribute that to the market hunting piece. A lot of the hunters doing that, because you had that going on at the same time as subsistence hunting, where it was your rural folks that were pretty much doing all that hunting. But the difference is, some of them were making a living on it by selling back east, for the most part, or selling to your bigger metro areas, even down south.
Sure.
And there's plenty of journals where you can see turkeys were selling for this much per pound, and there was a real trade going on.
So I think that's an interesting angle to highlight, that a lot of the people were hunting for subsistence to feed their own family, but there were also plenty of people that were market hunting, and they were trying to kill as many turkeys as possible to sell them to a market. And that starts to make sense why you might place a 2 bird per day limit. It starts to make more sense why something like that seems now to be really silly. That might have been a pretty important regulation at the time, especially when, it was indiscriminate of sex on top of, this basically unlimited bag with whatever method you could muster.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. It was 1905 was the Lacey Act. I think I've got that date right. But I mean, that would have been the first attempt to stop that, despite what state regulations were, just so people couldn't transport stuff over state lines and sell it. But of course, the problem is there's no teeth in it, because there's not the funding and the feet on the ground to stop that. But
Yeah, they
had
had a few
the right idea.
handful of game wardens making $12 a year or something like that at that point in time.
Yeah.
And I know Kelly, he writes in several of his books talking about how there were guys that used to dig trenches and line them with corn and then rake the trench with a large bore shotgun, so they'd kill the whole flock at once.
Oh yeah.
So there was a lot of that going on, but it seemed like I recall a passage in that same book where he was talking about the regulations, where he said that some of those fall and winter seasons at the time extended like into February. And so there was some opportunity for certain hunters in the South to start to experience hunting gobbling turkeys. Is that
Oh,
right? Do you
absolutely.
you recall
Yeah,
that?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's never been a time when there hasn't been a seasons extend into the gobbling season. It dipped quite a bit during, I
Yeah.
would say, like 1900 to 1950. That dipped a lot, but up through the late 1800s, like I said, there was I want to say it was 15 or more states. I'd have to go back and look at my data, but there was a lot of states that had seasons that went well into um, March and April,
Hmm.
and some of those were Western states too. At that time, a lot of people were, say, the late 1800s, early 1900s. A lot of people were traveling to Texas to hunt. That
Interesting.
was a real destination. And I've got a large magazine collection. I think I've got every magazine that's dedicated to wild turkeys in the, as the title or theme. I've got every single one, but I've also got about 1,000 magazines, or over 1,000, probably about 1,500, that are what I would call some turkey hunting, right? Some of them are more modern, but I've got at least 100 that are 1910 or before. And these
Oh
are
wow.
articles in magazines about turkey hunting. And what's impressed me is how many of those were in Texas. And what I come up with is it's where they had to go to hunt turkeys. A lot of the people at the time didn't have opportunity to hunt turkeys locally anymore, and
Yeah.
they were going to Texas and doing kind of a combo, deer and turkey hunt. But even then, there was people hunting turkeys in the spring. So
Yeah. Well, yeah, that is interesting, and that speaks back to a point that you made earlier about thinking that turkeys required extensive tracts of like bottomland hardwood forest to subsist. A lot of that was driven by the fact that that was the only little remnant holdout populations that we had at one point
Hmm.
because they weren't as accessible to market hunt.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's the same as when Lewis and Clark went across the country. And I always like to think about when they were going up the Missouri between Iowa and Nebraska, and I live in Iowa. And the fact that they were seeing, buffalo and grizzly bears and pronghorns and elk and stuff where I live. And
Hmm.
I've
Hmm.
even gone back and found another book that a professor from Iowa State did, called A Country So Full of Game. And it's about Iowa. And he goes back a lot like Hazen Wright did. He goes back to a lot of the early journals from, the military, explorer accounts, pioneers. And he's pulled together a picture of what the state of Iowa looked like from a wildlife ecology. And it's amazing how many species were here. And it pretty much, the story's all in the same way. Somebody saw a buffalo, somebody saw an elk, somebody saw a turkey, and everybody turned out to shoot the last one.
Mm.
That's
Hmm.
it gets to be like kind of like Theodore Roosevelt, right? I mean, he had to get past that buffalo hunt where he had to kill that buffalo bull, but it was later he sat back and he said, that doesn't seem like that's a good idea, right? And
Yeah.
then you start to see efforts of people to, because they have that attachment or nostalgia or regret, whatever it is, romanticism with that creature. And thankfully people got that with the wild turkey, or we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Hmm. Well, Brent, I've gotten curious while you were talking. So we were hunting them fall and winter, and some seasons started to extend into the spring. And I mean, we've kind of gone through a whole, well, I'll just say over time, a major shift where the majority of hunting now is in the spring, and the places where we're losing season. A lot of the time, that's the fall season. That's the first thing to go. So, could you kind of talk us through that timeline? And maybe are there key events or things that happened that have led to that transition away from the fall winter hunting to the spring hunting?
Man, I would love to have a couple of months to come back and answer that question because that deserves some thought. But I'll tell you what I think, and this is extremely just an opinion.
Well, I'll
is
stop you real quick. We'll hear
Yeah.
your opinion now, and then we'll give you a few months. And if you want to come back on, happy to have
Absolutely.
you again.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a lot of why we turkey hunt. Again, if we go back and say, and by the way, I helped get fall turkey hunting passed in Iowa when I was on the state board for the Wild Turkey Federation, and I was a very passionate fall turkey hunter for a number of years. Tried it with my dog, not the right. She was a lab. It was abusive for me to even think she'd be able to lay in a sack. I tried, but I did, bust and scatter, and I called in gobblers, and I had a great time doing it. But I've seen the local population, even though it's healthy, it's not what it was in the 1990s. And I still buy a fall tag every year. I didn't go once last year, and I'm not against it. I just think for me, it's not the same. My reason for doing it was truly because I felt like there was plenty of abundance. It was something I really got fun doing it at the time. But now I got to say, the gobble, even though I got them to gobble in the fall on occasion, that's hard to compare to a spring morning. And it is the gobble that we're hunting a lot of the times. I think most people, and you've talked about it on this show podcast, that a successful season to people, and I just filled out surveys for a couple states I hunted in, and the questions on there, did you hear gobbling, and what, looking for what was satisfying. If I turkey hunt and I'm Tom Kelly and I don't hear a gobble all season, and that, to me, that's crushing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even if I saw a turkey, never heard one gobble. And so part of it, I think, is our attachment to that experience leads us closer towards being fulfilled that way versus filling a tag. It's less about that for me. And I've got some friends that are very passionate fall turkey hunters, and it's a very neat culture, especially the folks that, have dogs that they love to make memories with. It's just, I wonder now, again, what do we know now? Why do we do it? And for me, I think it's something that I wouldn't want to give up the spring. And I listened to your, the podcast where you talked about, people will make the argument, well, the turkey is the only species we hunt during the mating season. Well, that's absolutely not true. We hunt there's other species hunted during the mating season.
Right.
It's just that I think we're always looking for what's the right and wrong reason we do it. And it's fair to bring that up as part of the discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to bring up every aspect of how we do this during a period of decline and make sure we flip it over, examine it from every facet, and then make sure that, the assumptions that we had about it to begin with were correct. And if they were not, update that and adapt going forward.
Yeah. So it sounds like, based on your thought right now, that it's probably more of the cultural part of it that has led to that transition, rather than, from a regulatory standpoint or something that has kind of led to that. That's what I heard from you. Do you disagree with that?
No, that's more or less it. You go to, there are just such, the vast majority of turkey hunters, I would argue, are hunting the gobble, and it's hard not to go to a group of turkey hunters, and that's the story you hear. It's just by sheer numbers, I think it's hard to avoid that. That's become a very cultural root of turkey hunting.
I think I like that term, and I'm going to adapt it into my everyday language is hunting the gobble. Because see, that way, when I go out and I don't bring a bird home, I've still been successful
You
and
should-
I can
I was hunting the
justify it.
gobble.
Yeah, I'll just tell my wife, I was just hunting the gobble. I wasn't hunting
Well,
Yeah.
the turkey
that's
behind
it.
it.
Yeah, I don't know if you know, but my hashtag on social media is gobble getter, and I've
Yeah.
had it misquoted 90% of the time as gobbler getter, and I say no, it's not, it's gobble getter. I
I
like to
think
get
I
the gobble.
probably said gobbler getter. Sorry if I have.
No,
Yeah, I like that a lot. I was also thinking through, um, with the fall and winter seasons, because it's often a large portion of the harvest is hands. And we just this past week, uh, Brent, I'm not sure if you've had time to listen to it, but we had the folks from South Dakota on, and they were talking about hen harvest, and they also were talking about how important adult hen survival was to the trajectory of populations. So I guess some of the transition for me away from that fall season would be more about protecting the hen, and
hmm
you know,
yeah,
uh, thinking through also. I can't remember the exact numbers, but Lovett Williams had a paper in maybe the late 70s where he was looking at hunter harvest. And I think the title of the paper says something along the lines of reproduction and success in a heavily hunted population. And I did not realize until I got down into the methods that he was talking about fall harvest. It was a heavy hunted population, and fall harvest was really high. And it was the hen harvest, even in that study, was the majority of them that he tagged. So when I was looking at that, I was like, oh, no wonder it had a big effect on the population. They were, almost all the hens he tagged in the study got killed by a hunter legally. So I just
wow,
found that really interesting, thinking through that, because I immediately associate hunting with spring, but a lot of these problems early on with populations, and a lot of the early work, they were probably talking about fall and winter harvest, and a substantial portion of that was probably hen.
yeah. Well, that makes sense. Yeah, yeah. I'll say from doing hunting in the fall, it would get frustrating at times for me because I could just about always find a flock of hens and young of the year. That
Mm-hmm.
was never the problem. It does take diligence and it takes persistence to get onto a gobbler flock.
Yeah.
That's a different hunt, and which is what makes it fun. And
Mm-hmm.
I again, as I read what I read, listen to what I listen to, another thought that's crossed my mind is just the realization of, if I shoot that hen, is that the super hen? Is that the one that
Mm-hmm.
has it, where
hmm
she's going to be the successful nester? I'm not just shooting a hen; I might be shooting the hen, and
hmm
that part stuck with me a little bit too, just in terms of, hey, I would love to make sure that there's going to be a sustainable flock. I used to take a lot of people hunting, and I would take them to some of the farms I hunt, and I even saw that was detrimental to the population. And now when I take people, I tell them find a place to go, or if you need help finding a place on public, I'll help and I'll take you, and that'll be your place where we'll scout it together, we'll hunt it together, and take the pressure off some of the same areas where, um, again, going back to even Jordan over 100 years ago, he's saying, try to leave a mature gobbler. I mean, whether that was right or wrong, the thought was there in
Mm-hmm.
terms of you need to leave some for seed.
Yeah,
Right.
sure. Huh.
Yeah.
So let's take us through, the start of the restocking effort in earnest now. So, we've got the cannon net, and that kind of helps move us away from the game farms, right?
Yeah, yeah. if I'm not mistaken, the cannon net was originally used on some waterfowl, and it might even have been in
That's right.
Europe. And then it was
Yeah.
Herman Duff Holbrook that used it the first time successfully for turkeys. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if he was the first one to use it for turkeys. Not sure who that
Yeah.
was.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not either.
And it all depends upon who wrote the article that
Yeah,
you
sure.
have to trust that, right? But
Yeah.
but what I like is the fact that got picked up on. It seems like after Duff Holbrook did that netting, people grasped, wow, that works.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to go back to that 1959 Wild Turkey Symposium as kind of the point at which you had all the right people in the room. So, you had, you had Mosby was there. Um, I think Lovett Williams was even there, but he was a very young man. So you had that whole span of, everybody there. Bailey was there. Um, all the folks that had been trying to do this at some level, but mostly at a state level, now got together and were able to have the conversation. And you probably heard me say it before, but anybody that doesn't have a copy of the original 1959 Wild Turkey Proceedings, it's worth your time to get it and read it, because to our great benefit, it's the actual dialogue that occurred. I wish they still did that. I mean, I wish you all, things like this, or as we're talking about, the science, it's neat to see the internal debate that's happening between the experts. And that's what you see in the 1959 Symposium, where the big idea of the time was game farm turkeys or wild trap turkeys.
Yeah, and they transcribed a lot of that meeting, right? Isn't that what you're saying?
They did. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I went back and
it's
looked
word
at
for
it.
word.
Yeah.
I went back and looked at it after hearing you say that. I went back, so I have it now, and I went back and looked at it because of that.
It's pretty cool how it puts
great.
you right back in that room,
Yeah.
It does.
70 years ago.
Brent, one thing, we're not transcribing it in the same way, but that was one of the ideas behind this podcast, is that we could bring scientists together, and sometimes we agree and sometimes we don't, and we can have a nice dialogue, and people can hear the different points of view. And we've had various people on talking about their point of view on various topics as a result of that.
Well, I think you've hit your stride. I mean, I was telling you earlier, I've been binging. I did the same thing last turkey season. As I'm driving state to state, that's what I do, is I listen to podcasts, and I mean, I remember after the first few episodes you did, I thought, this is a great idea, but it still seems really technical. Despite the folks you had on,
that was my fault.
Well, I'm just over the past year.
I don't even know how to spell technical.
I'm not the smart kid in the room right now, right? I realize that. I'm sitting here talking to two people who understand it to a whole different level, but yet we're able to have a conversation about it that not only I can enjoy, but others can as well. And that is exactly what we ought to be doing. That's turkey hunters do crave it. They want to know. The problem is many of us think we know. And that's where I said earlier, we have to unlearn. And a lot of what we know is based on some really, really deep and important stuff to us. It's that local knowledge that gets passed along. And it's some of it may be even right for where we're at, but it's not right for everywhere. And this is a platform where those ideas can get discussed in a way that makes it not only palatable, but actually in a really healthy, thought-provoking way.
Yeah. Well, we're trying. So we get a few complaints that we're overly technical still, and we still get a few that we need to be more technical. Actually, a handful of those. So to me, that sends a message that we're probably striking a balance. Hopefully.
Yeah.
For
sure.
I would say we get more feedback that we're somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
So that's good. Well, Brent, I think it's been phenomenal discussion for lots of things, but something's kind of been sticking with me that's that I wanted to ask you about. That's it's related, and you'll understand why, but it's not really about the biology of turkeys. I was more curious. With your uh, knowledge seeking, when you're looking for all of this literature, could you describe to us like what you're actually doing? Are you on a daily basis just going and googling things about turkeys, or are you in the in the basement in a library somewhere? Like, how are you going about digging up all this awesome historical information?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit of all that, but I would say the root of it is I have tried to seek out the people that I felt like could get me connected with what I needed or what I needed to know. That's kind of where it started, even before I was, let's say, doing a lot of Googling. So I found an article about a wild turkey literature collector from Minnesota named Marv Rooney, and I tracked him down and had a great conversation. Got an invite to his house, and I went. I saw what he had. It blew me away in terms of what amount of and he's somebody that reads it. Not all collectors read. I found that out pretty quick, which is fine. But he did, and that really appealed to me. And then over the years, I tracked a lot of biologists down and talked to them, and was able to get publications on the states they were in, which was immensely helpful. And I'm sure they get a number of requests for stuff like that. And fortunately, I was able to get a few of those neat old studies that otherwise I wouldn't have had the chance to read. I have hundreds of searches set up on different auction sites where I monitor. I've been to Jim Cassidy's house a couple times. If you know Jim Cassidy, he's been somebody that is a wild turkey historian very properly. So I've tried to learn what I can from him. He's been really gracious in helping me find what I would call online journal repositories that I didn't even know about, to go back and find some of this stuff from the 1800s and early 1900s. And I try to just do my best to help to share what I know, if that makes sense, because what I have found is I'm not the only one that's interested, but as I'm willing to share that, I've got many more people offering things back to me. And I'm not saying books or, I mean, dialogues like this, right? Where it's, and that's been the fun part, is not just being the collector, but trying to turn that more into a curator role, where it's more about what do I have that others would want to see or want to know. And that's what's made this a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, along those same lines, I'm interested in the origin story. Like, when did you decide that you were going to be a collector of old stuff about wild turkeys?
My wife would like to know that as well, because our finances probably can be traced back to that moment. Where
was there something distinct that kind of just set you on this path?
Yeah. I mean, to me, what it was, so when I started turkey hunting, I learned from reading. That was, so in Iowa, we didn't have turkeys to hunt until 74 was the first season. But where I lived, we didn't even see a wild turkey on the farm until 88. So it was after then I started hunting, and I went to wherever I could find a book to get and read. I got some videotapes and watched, right? That's kind of how I learned to do it. And my passion to learn it was pretty immense. And I'd say by around the late 90s, I had what I would call already a collection. I didn't intend for it to be that way. And part of me is just, I've always loved books. That's been in fact, as a kid, I wanted to be a librarian until I realized later it's hard to live my lifestyle if you're a librarian. You may have a lot of books, but they don't belong to you. And so anyway, that's when I said, I've got like the basis of a collection. And then it was in the early 2000s that I really started going out and meeting people. But it wasn't so much a singular event as kind of just the
Mm-hmm.
realization that, wow, this is kind of neat. I'm getting a collection put together, and it was when I found the other collectors that I started to seek that it really took, and I went from, literature to books and audio, video, and just collect about everything now.
Yeah, that's really cool. So, is there anything that you have found that just sticks in your mind as like a key moment where you found a piece of literature or maybe an item related to turkey hunting or something that just like really blew you away?
Yes, and for those on the video, you might be able to see it, but there's a well-known call maker named Ralph Permar from Pennsylvania that makes mouth yelper, or makes suction yelpers, and over my shoulder I've got a rack full of his stuff that has
Mm-hmm.
been field proven, and his wife is from near me, so in fact, he's coming tomorrow. They're back, but he was over at my house visiting one day, and he was looking for a copy of the original 1914 McElhaney Jordan book, The Wild Turkey and Its Hunting. And I had this copy as an extra copy. I'd purchased it because it said it was a signed copy. And as a literature collector, a signed anything is huge. When I got it, I saw the signature was not um, it was not McElhaney, and I was disappointed. Um, and I asked Ralph, he'd asked about wanting a book, and I said, well, here, I've got this, and we'll trade it for a call or something. And he looked at it and he said, you don't want to trade this one. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, do you know who that is? And I looked at it again. I said, John K. Renault. And I said, oh, yeah, I do know. It's Jordan's best friend who wrote the book, and it's the guy that gave the manuscript to McElhaney. And this is a copy that he inscribed to someone.
Wow.
And there was an
Wow.
article that came out in 1930 or 32 in the Louisiana Conservation Journal by a guy named Cope, where he talks about the book wasn't selling great for McElhaney, and why not? Because there were no turkey hunters at the time. That was pretty lean years for a turkey hunting audience. Thank
Yeah.
goodness I didn't write my book then.
It's
But
ahead of its
anyway,
time.
yeah, he gave 10 copies of the book to Renault, it said, as a thank you for giving him the manuscript. And so I'd like to think this is one of those 10 presentation copies that he got.
Wow.
And then even better, a few years ago, I found out that there was a hunting journal that John K. Renault kept. And a good friend of mine, Danny Ellis, in Charlotte, North Carolina, had purchased an original Charles Jordan call. And Charles Jordan is royalty in wild turkey circles. He's the guy that essentially wrote the first book. He was the first, maybe well-known call maker of the suction type calls. And Danny was able to buy for well into the 5 figures that call. That was, it said, to John K. Renault from CL Jordan, to J.K. Renault from CL Jordan. And it's got the date on it and everything. And when Danny bought that, there was also this hunting journal that Renault kept, and he didn't want it at the time. He spent enough on the call. And when I found out that this was in existence, I worked hard to track it down. And when I did, it took me a couple years to negotiate the purchase, but I was able to do that. And I've been able to purchase this, and I've got it protected, but I've been all the way through it. And there are quite a few turkey hunts that Renault records in this game register. And he's got like a paragraph on each one. And this goes back to 1872.
Wow.
That's
And
cool.
there are a number of hunts with Charles Jordan in here, which
Wow.
is super cool. Handwritten accounts of the two guys hunting together. And being the nerd that I am, I've taken every one of those entries, put it in a spreadsheet so I don't have to keep opening the book. And then I did kind of some data mining, and you can see how many turkeys that were no killed over the years. And I've got whether it was spring or fall, in terms of what I would call the season, and the method of take, how many he saw, who he was with. And it's very clear that most of the gobblers he killed in the spring were with Jordan, and his success rate when he was with Jordan was over twice what he was when he was alone. When he was hunting with the master, let's say, he even missed less because he tended to miss quite a bit, and he missed less with Jordan. You could see almost the shame in his words, when that would happen. But as a literature collector and somebody that loves the history, those pieces are ones that felt like they connected me back to the roots of this, which was pretty special.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, me and Marcus kind of have that relationship. When he shows up, my success goes down, though.
I'll keep that
I don't
in
know
mind.
if that's true. I don't think that's true at all.
Oh
Yeah,
man,
shoot.
that is super cool. And kind of along the lines of that question that Marcus just asked, one of the things that I wanted to make sure and ask you today is, what are we forgetting about wild turkeys? What is it that people have known? It doesn't have to be biological, but it can even be social or historical, philosophical. But what is something that we've left in the past and people have tended to forget about?
A great question, and to me, you said it's the social wild turkey. My fear is that we've become so fixated culturally with our turkey hunting around numbers and slams and everything else. And I love hunting turkeys all over too, but when it becomes inches and it becomes number of states, or you put any measurement on it like that, I think it lessens the overall respect that we're likely to have as a group for the turkey. At the individual, it may not be true, right? There may be somebody that really loves to measure spurs or wants to kill a turkey in every state, and they may love the wild turkey 5 times as much as I do, and I know a couple of those people, right? Very, very wonderful people. But when we start to turn it into a trophy sport, I think that's where we start to detach ourselves from the social being that is the wild turkey. And what this is probably hypocrisy to say this, but my favorite wild turkey book is not the 10th Legion, and it's not the old Pro Turkey Hunters. Those are in my top 3, but my number 1 is Joe Hutto's Illumination in the Flatwoods. And it's not so much a book about turkey hunting, it's a book about the wild turkey. And I just exchanged emails with Joe this morning and told him I was going to be on here, and he said, tell those guys hi, I love what they're doing. And I think that's a great compliment, but that's coming from a guy that lived for 18 months with wild, and he was a wild turkey, right? And as I read his book over and over, it takes me back to this mindset that this is a sentient creature that is, if intelligence not the right word, caring is, at least, because there's a caring there from the social structure of turkeys. That doesn't mean they don't fight, and so do humans, but there is some really incredible respect I've got for the wild turkey just for what it is, as one of God's creatures that has such an amazing life that when I hunt it, I don't want to forget that. And there's not a turkey that I don't shoot that it doesn't cross my mind, right? I think that all those, that's what I don't want to see lost.
Yeah. Yeah. It has inherent value. It's not just something that's there for us to, take as we please.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think that reading Illumination, the Flatwoods will, if for folks that haven't, it will give you that deeper level of respect, not only of their consciousness, almost, I think is kind of what you were speaking to, their self-awareness or their awareness of, conspecifics and things like that, but then also just all the things that they go through and what they can learn and how they have that memory of the things in their environment. I mean, it just gave me a much more deeper appreciation for the bird.
I agree. Yeah, really phenomenal book, and wholeheartedly agree with why I got into this, and trying to keep that special relationship, as opposed to moving to whatever it is that it seems we're moving to, where we're counting, how many and how big and where.
Yeah. And I think as a testament to that, if folks, that are out there listening right now, if you look at the deer hunting world and you see, this the significant emphasis by, some groups on just inches of antler and so on and so forth, and you don't like that with turkeys, like that's one of the things, I would say that we should try to avoid making it into a quantitative endeavor, right? For lack of a better term, to kind of encapsulate everything you were talking about, Brent. It's like how many we've killed, what the stats of an individual bird was, or where we've killed them, and all those things. And I would encourage folks to think about, well, if you don't like some of that extreme side of the spectrum in regards to that perspective with deer hunting, then maybe that should tell you something about how we should be thinking about turkey hunting going
Hmm.
forward. And it definitely, for me, is one of those it's one of the attributes of turkey hunting that makes me enjoy it the most, is because in previous years, and still to this day, I've done a lot of work with intensive management for deer on trophy managed properties, and a lot of that ended up over time diminishing my enjoyment of the pursuit of deer hunting. And I found myself getting back, and we all have the opportunity to hunt how we want to, so I found
Mm.
myself going back more so in line with when I do deer hunt, how I used to deer hunt. But I don't want to see that happen to turkeys, because turkeys allow me to step away from that to enjoy the experience, the interaction with the animal. And then in the event that there is a successful harvest, then all the measurements, the quantitative stuff, if I even measure anything, is just an added bonus. Like, all I care about, this is a fully sexually mature adult turkey, and I battled with him. I did it the way that I felt was ethical, and from a place of appreciation and respect for the bird, and then everything else is icing on the cake.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree, Will.
Sorry, I didn't mean to end up on a diatribe, but I think I did.
We're right there with you.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Joe and his book, we have invited Joe on. He agreed that he would come on. We hadn't been able to work it out just yet, but we're planning to do that. So
thank goodness I'm on before him. Otherwise, wow, that would have been a wah wah.
No. I mean, I really admire your dedication to what you've gotten really intrigued by, and how that's led you down that path. I had I tend to do things like that as well in different areas. Mine more in the research realm, but I certainly appreciate that. But also, I know that you've recently released a book, so I didn't know if you want to tell people, what the book is about, and how they can get it if they like it. We can link it in the show notes as well.
No, thanks. Yeah, so I look back at my roots of turkey hunting, and like I said, I had to go and I had to get books and videos and kind of teach myself. And for that video portion and the calls that I was using, they were production calls that I
Mm-hmm.
made my first memories in the woods with. And I suspicion so did most of the people listening to this, because they're just widely available, and some of them are really great calls. And as I saw others around me having nostalgia with that, and I've got a deep appreciation of some of those companies that, and many that I didn't have the time or ability to write about, because the book's already 228 pages focusing on three companies. But Will and Jimmy Primos, and David Hale and Harold Knight, and Dick, Chris, and Bev Kirby kind of anchor the book in terms of Primos, Nightingale, and Quaker Boy. And in my introduction and preface, I talk a little bit about my journey with the wild turkey's journey, and how these companies played to my favor, as well as millions of others. And then I just took the time to spend time with each of those folks, other than Dick, who's passed away, of course. But Chris was very gracious in giving me time, just as Will and Jimmy and Harold and David were, and really went deep into what was their story. How did they? Most of them didn't hunt turkeys, other than Harold Knight. They didn't hunt turkeys growing up. They didn't have them.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only later in life they started hunting turkeys. But we share that, right? Where we fell in love with it, and it becomes part of that thread, part of that lifestyle. And they built multi-million-dollar companies doing what they love. And it's really a great story in terms, kind of like the American dream is what I say. Yelp and Gobble Inc. is the name of the book. How restoring the wild turkey spurred on a game called innovation boom. And
cool.
It's also got a chapter on a couple of individuals who helped those companies succeed. Mike Batty, who was a call designer, and Anthony Foster, who was I would say both a call designer and kind of runs the production floor. But folks like that are maybe unsung heroes that helped to make that happen. But it's just it's the story of somebody doing what they love, and it just happens to be something that most of us listening to this probably love as well. So anybody is interested in the book, they can send me an email at roglodge4@hotmail.com, ROGLODGE 4@hotmail.com, or I'm on Instagram. I'm Gobble Getter, and I'm on Facebook as Brent Rogers. So happy to put that in folks' hands if they want it.
Yeah,
cool.
That Gobble Getter does not have an R in it. Until you get to the end.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I mean, thanks for what you do, Brent. I think this is really important just because, for various reasons that we've talked about, there are aspects surrounding the social side of turkey hunting and that whole fabric, and then also aspects of what we understand about the biology and the life history of the species that need to be preserved or they'll be forgotten. And unfortunately, I feel like, we're in a kind of a time now where we had some of those early turkey researchers and scientists that you talked about, and then we kind of had that next generation, and now it seems like we're going a generation beyond that. So that previous generation's knowledge, I think, stands to be lost if it's not well documented and collected somewhere, and especially if there's folks out there like you that are kind of synthesizing some of that information for us, that don't have the time or the inclination to go through thousands of volumes, to try to pull it all together. So that's really important, and we appreciate that.
Well, thanks. I think we're all through our different mediums, we're all trying to help, make it better for the next generation. That's kind of what we're all hopefully doing is, pass along something better than you found. And part of that is talking about it, getting to the facts, and sharing what you know. I think that's the business we're in.
Yeah, really cool. Well, Brent, is there anything that we missed or that we should have asked you?
No. However, since you're going to have Joe on, be sure to ask him about his recent revelation with snakes and eggs. He sent me an email, and it's pretty amazing what he's witnessing with some wood duck eggs and the number of snakes that they're attracting. It's almost like biblical proportion of what is going on here. So that'll create some good discussion between you all.
Oh, I'm sure that won't get anyone fired up.
Yeah. They're going to get fired up just because you mentioned it.
Yeah.
That's right.
Already. Yeah, you're right.
Yep. Okay. Well, it's been a real pleasure having you on here. Really enjoyed talking to you and hearing the history, and we'd love to have you back on. We can revisit the question I posed that you wanted a few months for. But yeah, it's really great content, and appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Yeah, and I will add in that that Brent, had an appearance or I don't know if you call it an appearance, I don't know what the technical term for that is, but you played a role in a recent film that was put out by MossyOak, The Colonel and the Fox, and you go a lot into the history of the wild turkey in that film as well. If folks haven't had a chance to check that out yet, get some more Brent content there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a humbling project to be a part of. And thank you both again for doing what you do. It's been my pleasure to be here.
Yep, glad to do it.
Thanks everybody out there for listening. We really appreciate all the support. And if you haven't had a chance, please rate the podcast, share it with your friends and family. Anything we can do to grow it, hopefully will be better for the wild turkey.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.